This is Sarah Wilkinson from Humber College and the University of Guelph Humber. In this video, I'm going to discuss what is the AVO2 difference. The AVO2 difference is short form for the arteriovenous oxygen difference. And this is the difference in the amount of oxygen in the arterial blood compared to the venous blood. So we could say it's the difference in the amount of oxygen delivered to the tissue compared to the amount of oxygen leaving the tissue. And really what it tells us is how much oxygen is extracted at the tissue. We know that we use oxygen for aerobic ATP production, so that if there is a higher AVO2 difference, there's going to be more metabolic activity going on in that tissue. Let's take a look at a capillary passing around a muscle cell. Here we have the arterial side of our capillary with our red blood cells passing through. And here we have the venous side, and I've represented this large circle as the tissue that is extracting oxygen. So at rest, on the arterial side, there's about 20 mils of oxygen per 100 mils of blood. And that as the red blood cell passes through the capillary, it's going to drop off oxygen. So that by the time the red blood cells arrives on the venous side, there's about 15 milliliters of oxygen per 100 milliliters of blood. So the AVO2 difference, the difference between the arterial and the venous side, is 5. And this represents how much oxygen is extracted from the tissue. So 5 mils of oxygen per 100 mils of blood has been delivered to the tissue. When we increase the intensity of exercise, so for example, during maximal exercise, we're going to be using much more oxygen, and hence more oxygen needs to be dropped off. For most people, we still have about 20 mils of oxygen per 100 mils of blood, although that does vary depending on your training status. And that oxygen is going to be dropped off. However, much more oxygen is going to diffuse into the muscle cell so that less leaves, less is available in the venous side. So about 5 mils of oxygen per 100 mils of blood during really maximal exercise. And that's going to result in a much higher AVO2 difference. So here we've got an AVO2 difference of about 15 milliliters of oxygen per 100 mils of blood that's been extracted by the tissues. In that quick example, I showed you that AVO2 difference increases as exercise intensity increases. So I showed you both the resting situation and the maximal exercise situation, which I've graphed here. On the y-axis, I've got AVO2 difference, the amount of oxygen extracted by the tissue. And on the x-axis, I've got exercise intensity, represented by percent of VO2 max. So we can see at rest, we had an AVO2 difference of about 5, and maximal exercise, an AVO2 difference of about 15. There are differences between individuals. We'll say that this is the approximate graph we would see for a sedentary individual. However, in endurance training athletes, they have a greater capacity to extract oxygen at the tissues due to many, many different factors. So more type 1 muscle fibers, greater mitochondrial density, capillary density, a greater capacity to use oxygen to produce ATP, many, many different things. And so what we see is both at rest and during maximal exercise, they're going to have a higher AVO2 difference. So endurance trained people have a higher max AVO2 difference, which is one of the factors that's going to result in a higher VO2 max. So to recap, the arteriovenous oxygen difference, short form AVO2 difference, is the difference in the amount of oxygen in the arterial blood compared to the venous blood. So that is the amount of oxygen delivered to the tissue compared to the oxygen leaving the tissue. And it represents how much oxygen is extracted by that tissue.